Hi, and welcome back to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas. We're going to be covering CDFM Module 2.2 at this time, which is Cost and Economic Analysis. We will begin on page 2.2.5 and looking at the introduction to the DoD Decision Support Systems. We covered some of this in previous lessons. So I want you to look at the diagram at the top of page 2.2.5 at the DoD Decision Support Systems. So there are three systems. We talked about JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. We've talked about the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution System, or PPBE process. We are now going to be focusing on the Defense Acquisition Management System. So when you deal with cost and economic analysis, it comes into play primarily with the acquisition process. So that kind of shows how all three systems overlap to develop the DoD strategy, which is annotated in that circle in the middle. The QDR, the quadrennial report, is that every 4 years. So that quadrennial report is DoD strategies. And we've learned that in prior lessons in part 1 of the CDFM module 2. So the first paragraph on page 2.2.5 talks about, in order to accomplish the DoD's mission, we utilize these various systems because the system and the processes are real complex. So we need different systematic processes to help us to get to the right mix, the right level of resources. The key to identifying resources necessary to meet the needs are several decision support systems. And we talked about the three. Make sure you know what those three are and who are responsible for running them. So there are three key processes and the capability. So again, where the idea and the mission of the Department of Defense is to deliver the capabilities to the warfighter at the time when required. And so that's basically what's being discussed in the first paragraph. The last paragraph is just mentioning the last sentence. Linking these decision support system is the department's quadrennial defense review. So based on what the strategy is for the Department of Defense in the QDR quadrennial review, then these system has to all be in line with ensuring that we accomplish the DoD strategy. So on page 2.2.6 at the top, you see that we're discussing the PPBE, that's the resource management process that's used, the principal resource allocation process used. We talked about JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. That's the system that is used to identify capability gaps in our requirements. What are the gaps or capability that we have that we need to then develop in an acquisition process? There's some key things that you need to look at on page 2.2.6 under the JCITS. The first paragraph, first sentence tells you what it's used for. Towards the end of that paragraph, it says, supported by robust analytical processes, the JCITS identifies capability gaps, which we talked about, and potential solutions, considering the full range of, and I'm going to pause there. For those who've worked in TRADOC, you're familiar with the .MLPF. What that simply means is to identify training requirements. What type of training do we need? What type of resources, manpower? What do we need in our training? So you look at doctrine. Do we need to make a change in our doctrine? Organizational structure. Do we need one more of this rank, less of that rank? Training material, leadership, and education, personnel, and facilities. So the acronym is DOT-MLPF. So we analyze each one of those areas to determine which area requires us to fill that capability gap. What is the area that we need to fill for that solution? So let me not ponder into that too long so I don't confuse matters. So when you look at the .MLPF, if the material solution is what's necessary to fill the gap, that is what triggers the acquisition system. So let me say that again. JSIS is based on a series of top-down analysis, strategic level guidance. We talked about the national security strategy in 2.1, national military strategy, joint vision. So based on all of the higher commands strategy, focus, and what they want us to deliver as far as DoD, that will determine what capability is necessary to fill the gap. So again, with the defense acquisitions process, it's about interoperable system. Simply means you don't just buy a system that operates completely by itself. We want to be able to interchange parts and so forth. So interoperable. We don't want to always have to go to research and start from scratch. Can we enter a different phase in the acquisition process to speed up that process to be able to fill that gap when we need it? Some other things in the second paragraph. It identifies the shortcomings and assess the risk associated with these gaps. These gaps may be addressed by a combination of material and or non-material. Recommended material solutions, once approved, is what leads to the acquisition process. So taking all of that, JSIDS is a system that is used to, once we determine what our strategy needs to be, what we need to get done, JSIDS is a system that is used to look at our capability, what capabilities we already currently have, identify the capability gap, then also the solutions to fill the capability gap. To fill the solutions, you look at the .MLPF, and we discussed those already. If the solution is a material solution, that is what triggers the acquisition process. So that's page 6 in a nutshell. Page 2.2.7, that diagram is the acquisition life cycle, and the rest of the information therefore or forthcoming is taking each phase, each section, each milestone in parts and gaining a better understanding of what happens at each level. So on page 2.2.7, it says the defense acquisition system is the management system process that guides all DoD acquisition programs. And DoD Directive 5000.01, the Defense Acquisition System, provides the policies and principles that govern the DAS. The DoDI 5000.01 talks about the operation of the Defense Acquisition System. So you can read through the rest of that. The Defense Acquisition Management Framework provides an event-based process where acquisition programs proceed through the series of milestones. So the key here is understanding that we will have 3 milestones, 5 phases, and 3 acquisition activities. So you think of the word activity, and those are, we're going to look at each one of those, so I don't want to go into it. So 3 activities, 3 milestones, and 5 phases. The second paragraph, ultimately, the defense acquisition system is about successfully managing risk. So looking at the capability, we want to successfully manage risk and while we are filling that capability gap. So this includes schedule risk, performance risk, and particularly cost risk. I'm sorry, my brain's not working right now. All right, so this includes schedule risk. So again, if you have a certain scheduled timeline that a project is supposed to get done, the acquisition process with the various decision points in each phase and each timeline to make sure that we are on time, we are on schedule, we are along the same cost factor that we estimated, we are still there. So at the very last sentence, it talks about cost as an independent variable throughout the acquisition process, and an analysis of alternatives is performed very early in the process. So basically, if you can do the management or military decision-making process, it's the same thing. Is you identify the issue, then you have to come up with an analysis of alternative. Those are your courses of action. What are the different selection choices that we have to fill this capability gap? And then once you determine what it is, then you're going to say, well, how much is that going to cost? And you're not just looking at initial cost to buy the item. What's the total cost from the time I initiate the process to the time I get a usable end item with all the supporting elements to it? How much is that cost? So cost as an independent variable is the idea that the best time to reduce your cost is early on in the process. So you identify all those risk factors and your mitigation factors that you put into place. All right, let's turn to page 2.2.8, the first paragraph. So what we're doing here is we are re-looking at the JSIDs. So it says, the DoD system by which gaps in military warfighting capabilities are assessed and potential solution to resolve. Bottom line, that is your JSIDs process. So what this saying is, and JSIDs is the responsibility of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, who is chaired by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's going back to section 2.1. So I want to always go back to recap to show you how these things tie in together. So once the JSIDs and they identify the gap, there's an initial capability document that this organization, this group develops. So they don't just automatically say, oh, it's going to require a material solution and don't produce any documentation. So once all of that research is done, then an initial capabilities document is annotating all the requirements, the gap, and the required solution to fill the gap. So that's what it's talking about, the ICD. The broad time-based operational goals and a description of the required capabilities to address a specific gap. If a material solution is considered the most appropriate method, I'm still in the first paragraph, the last sentence, to resolve the identified gap, the next step is to start action on an acquisition program. This is when the Defense Acquisition Management System becomes involved. So that's recapping. And PEEB comes in when we're trying to determine what's the best time now to ask for the funding. We got to go through. So all of these systems overlap at each time. And it's the responsibility of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the Defense Acquisition Executive, your Comptroller, your ASA FMMC, who's responsible for the budget and the execution phase, all of those key players we talked about in the first section. It's their job to ensure that all these processes at any given time are still in line with the DoD strategy at that point. We talked about in the second paragraph, we mentioned in the last page, the DoD or the DODI instruction. That's your Department of Defense directive. The 5000.01 was simply about the defense acquisition system. And then the 5000.02 was about the process, the operation of that system. So that's what they're telling and repeating again. Under that, you see the acquisition activity. So remember, I said, and the reason I said them in that order, because that's the order in which they occur. 3 activities, 3 phases, 3 activities, 3 milestones, 5 phases. I got to say it fast so I'll mess it up. All right. So the first activity, and all of this, if you keep your finger on page 2.2.7, is going back to that diagram at the top. If you look at the diagram, let's go back to page 7. The very left portion of that diagram where it says milestone A, B, C, that little square to the left is the ICD. That's the ICD we just talked about, that initial capability document that says this is what needs to be done. Then you have decision points under that. If you look, the first activity is the pre-systems acquisition. So that's what we're going to be talking about on the bottom of page 8. And so the first activity, we identified that it's a material solution. The first activity is pre-systems acquisition. We're not buying anything yet. So just because the JROC and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff recommend and says this capability gap can be filled with a material solution, there's still analysis. There's still research that has to be done to make sure that we need the acquisition process. So pre-systems acquisition, at the time, work efforts during this period are prior to there being a formal acquisition program. All of this is before the formal program. The first phase of the acquisition is the material solution analysis. So that's the analysis. Now we know it's a material solution. In the pre-system process, we now need to do material solution analysis. So there's a few things going on there. So the purpose of the material solution analysis is to assess potential material solution to satisfy the phase specific. So based on the time frame when they need the item, we need to do an extensive analysis by the milestone decision authority. Again, we touched on MDA's. Milestone decision authority is that senior individual that's been selected as that decision maker for what happens with that process. Do we go to the next level? Are we spending too much? Are we within the timeline, the schedule that was initially requested? So that milestone decision authority has that responsibility. So the MDA, the phase begins with the material development decision review. Before any phase, before any activity occurs, the MDA will always do some form of review to determine if the energy, if the money, if the resources needs to go to the next level to do that analysis, because it takes a lot of time and money. And if they do their review and determine, you know what, we don't need this anymore, our strategy is heading in a different direction, then they may not even continue into the acquisition process. So the material solution analysis begins with the material development decision review. which is the formal entry point into the acquisition process. That review is mandatory for all programs. A decision by the MDA, Milestone Decision Authority, to begin the material solution analysis phase does not mean a new acquisition program has been initiated. It simply gives approval for preparation of an analysis of alternatives, whose purpose is to assess the potential material solution to satisfy the capability need document in the previously approved ICD, Initial Capabilities Document. Funding in this phase is normally limited to that needed to satisfy the objectives of the phase. And so I'm reading it because it is essential for you to read it, then pause, and then analyze the words. Because when you see things like this and you read it on a test, individuals typically get overwhelmed because there's so much words that they're talking about. But it's simply what it is. You identify a material solution is necessary. You enter the pre-systems acquisition activity, which starts with a material development review by the Milestone Decision Authority. The Milestone Decision Authority was approved for you to go ahead and do an analysis. The analysis required is called the analysis of alternative. That's simply a course of action. Once he says do the analysis is, okay, let's do a course of action analysis. So that's the best way how to look at it, to make sure that we are meeting the initial capability document. So that's the material solution analysis. The next phase, so that's the 5 phases. So phase 2 is technology development. So now we've done our analysis and we've selected a course of action, or we have our recommendation. So we've done our analysis and we have our recommendation for which course of action is best. Technology development phase. Entry into this phase occurs with a successful Milestone A decision review. So remember I said there were 3 activities. We just looked at 1 pre-system, 5 phases. We looked at material solution, technology development, and we talked about 3 phases. So your 3 milestone. So milestone A comes in your technology development. And so what it's saying is a successful Milestone A decision review. So again, before you enter any phase. So basically what you can say, and that's why I say this material is a little bit difficult, so I'm going to slow down here. After the material solution analysis, and you can write this in, there is then a Milestone A decision review. So you can write that in between material solution analysis and technology development. Then once you have an approval of the Milestone A decision, then you begin technology development, which makes sense. So the purpose of your technology development is to reduce technology risk, determine and mature the appropriate set of technologies to be integrated. So you want to look and see, are there any other technologies that's existing that we can tap into? We don't have to start from scratch. There may be an existing, or even in the commercial realm, they may have something similar that all we need to do is tap into what's already there. So you look at those under your technology development. What else do we have here? Highlighted. Okay, so entrance into this phase is dependent upon completion of the analysis of alternatives. So that's kind of redundant because we already said at the top is we're doing the analysis of the alternative in our material solution analysis. So we can't enter technology development until we've done the analysis of alternatives. So you have a proposed material solution and full funding for the planned technology activity. So your ICD tells you what you need. You did your analysis of alternative. Then you do a milestone A decision review. So that's a decision point before technology development. You've completed your analysis of alternative, and then you're going through your technology development. So current policy, we got to make sure we ask. So funding is actually covered on page 11. I think, yeah, page 10, the top of page 10. So we're going to wait till then to tell you what type of funding is used for each one of these phases. And we'll tie it back into this. So we're still on technology development. At the very last sentence, it says, so remember the risk, what you're trying to do with technology development, reduce technology risk. We want to determine and mature the appropriate set to be integrated and to demonstrate critical technology elements on prototype. So we want to see what are the critical things that we need, and we build prototypes to determine, make sure that they actually do what we expect them to do. At the top, okay, last sentence. A favorable milestone A decision also does not mean a new acquisition program has been initiated. So the best thing to remember that a new acquisition program has not started if you're still in the pre-systems acquisition activity in the process, in that whole process. All right, let's look at the top of page 9. That's your second activity. 3 activities, 3 milestones, 5 phases. All right, so systems acquisition. So the first one was pre-system. So we know at the end, a favorable milestone A does not mean I'm going into the whole acquisition program. Systems acquisition begins at the top of page 9, where it says, assuming work efforts accomplished in the previous phases indicate the required technology is reachable. We've done all the analysis, we've done some prototypes, and we say, yes, material solution is the right answer. So then the appropriate milestone decision authority may allow the pre-system to continue its progression in the acquisition process. So I'm going to go down to the next phase, which is phase 3, is engineering and manufacturing development. And what it states, entry into this phase occurs with a successful milestone B decision review. So bottom line is between where the systems acquisition paragraph where that ends and before engineering, you can put or write in milestone B decision review as their review before every phase. So once the milestone B review has been approved, then we begin the engineering, and engineering can tell you that now the purpose of this phase is to actually develop a full-fledged system or an increment of capacity, complete full system integration. Technology risk reduction should have already occurred during the technology development. We just talked about that. Develop an affordable and executable manufacturing process. So I'm not going to read all that. Design for productability, ensure affordability, critical program information. Okay, so lots of good stuff. Go down to where it says milestone B. For most acquisition programs, milestone B is considered formal approval for program initiation. So if you get to the point between systems acquisition, when that activity starts, and you do the milestone B decision review, Once that approved, that is the point where you enter the acquisition system. That's what it's saying there, or the acquisition process. Funding for the entire EMD, that's your engineer and manufacturing development. So what we need to identify, there's a couple things here that I have highlighted. Funding for the entire EMD is normally a requirement to begin the phase. In addition to formal program initiation and permission to enter the EMD phase, there are two other important decisions made at milestone B. The quantity, we want to know low rate initiation production. How much are we going to initially produce of that system? And the second one says whether advanced procurement will be requested when the system ultimately enters the production and deployment phase. That's the final phase where we go into full-fledged. So, quantity of low rate initial production and whether advanced procurement will be requested. So now we're tying into PEEB again because we got to figure out when we actually need the funding to start these processes. So you got to take all these phases and these milestones into different small chunks to see how it all ties together. So systems acquisition, at the end, once that starts, you do a milestone decision review. An approval for the milestone decision review will then trigger to enter the engineering and manufacturing phase. A couple of other decisions that are made in the milestone B, which is the actual approval to enter into the acquisition process, is the quantity of low rate initiation production and whether advanced procurement will be requested. All right, so we're still on page 2.2.9. And after the engineering and manufacturing development, you see the next phase, which is phase 4, is production and deployment. But let's read the first sentence. Entry into this phase occurs with a successful milestone C decision review. So between the engineering and manufacturing and production, in between there, you can write milestone C decision review. Once that's approved, you enter into the production and deployment. So let's see what's important here. It gives you the purpose of that phase. The purpose, so make sure you know the purpose of each one of these phases. Because if you notice, for most of them, it's given to you in that first couple sentences. The purpose of this phase is to achieve an operable operational capability that satisfies mission needs. Production and deployment means, all right, full-fledged, let's go ahead and produce that actual item. Operational test and evaluation shall determine the effectiveness and suitability of the system. The MDA, Milestone Decision Authority, makes the decision to commit DoD to production at this milestone and documents the decision in an ADM, and I'll tell you what it is in a minute. So whenever you see an acronym, if you don't know what it means, you need to find out what it means. And milestone C specifically authorizes entry into the low rate initiation production. So in engineering, all we're trying to figure out is the quantity of the LRIP, low rate production. But it isn't until we get to the production and deployment that it authorized entry into, now we can start actually creating those LRIP numbers that were created. All right, page 211. Let's look at to the last sentence where under milestone C, it says Acquisition Decision Memorandum. That's what ADM stands for. The last paragraph on page 11. So I'm flipping back to page 9. So again, production and deployment. The purpose of that is to create the actual item. The milestone decision makes the decision to commit. So in the production and deployment, they make a decision. I'm committing the Department of Defense to produce these items. Milestone C, which is what we're in, is the point that authorizes now we can start producing the LRIP that was discussed in the engineering. So milestone B is that formal entry point into the acquisition process. Milestone C authorizes entry into LRIP. All right, some other things at the bottom of the same paragraph. While a successful milestone C review enables the program to enter into LRIP, only after a later successful full rate production decision review may the program go into full rate production. So that's saying, remember, we got approval for the initial quantity in milestone B under the engineering. Production and deployment, we actually got approval to actually start producing the LRIP. What we just read is saying, before we start full rate production, we got to have a decision review before it to approve the full rate. So at every one of those points, there is a decision review conducted to ensure that we still need those requirements to fill that capability gap. Is it still cost effective? During this phase, the program also achieves its initial operational capability, which is specific. That means it has a specific date by which a specified operational capability provided by the acquisition system is attained. So this is a point, achieves its initial operational capability. You're actually putting it in action. The third activity is sustainment. So pre-systems acquisition, the systems acquisition, and sustainment. Sustainment is simply now we have all these new vehicles in production, deployed out to the organization. Now we need to sustain them. So let's talk about sustainment. Sustainment at this point in the life of an acquisition program, we have usable end items intended to provide the capability gap that we identified in JSIDs necessary by the end user and has been produced, and a significant portion of the ultimate quantity of those items have been deployed according to service, so that all are out in the field. So operation and support. The purpose of this phase is to execute a support system or maintenance. How are we going to keep these items going? Life cycle support plan is mentioned here. So you can read through those. Let me see. Towards the end of the paragraph, during this phase, the program also achieves its fully operational capability, which occurs when the total quantity of operational items is deployed to the warfighter. At the end of its useful life, a system is then demilitarized and disposed of. Demilitarized means they take all the parts that makes it in military equipment. So like Humvees we have on the street is demilitarized. They don't have all the extra up armor things on them, and disposed of in accordance with all legal and regulatory requirements and policies relating to safety. So operation and support. So what we're going to look at on the next page and the next video is the type of funding, because you need money to do all of this. So what type of appropriation is used at each one of these phases to get the job done?